Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is...
My name is Sean Johnson Andrews. I'm an associate professor at Columbia College, Chicago.
And it's wonderful to see you, Sean. You're an old friend, not elderly, but a friend of long standing and someone I greatly admire. Are you in Chicago as you speak to us?
Yes. Yeah, I'm in Chicago. I'm in the basement on the north side of Chicago.
So, White Sox, Cubs division means something or no?
No, mostly I just follow the high school and elementary school sports. Those are the only sports I'm mostly
Very good.
following.
And so the north-south divide of Chicago doesn't really apply.
No.
Really.
We go to the citywide meets. So it
Very
doesn't really matter. It
civilized.
doesn't really matter.
Very civilized. For those listeners who don't know or care about baseball, maybe the greatest, most powerful division in the whole of US pro sports is between the north and south sides of Chicago. I think that'd be fair
Yes.
to say, wouldn't it, Sean?
Well, you know more about the sports landscape in general, but definitely here in Chicago, that is a major dividing line.
And Columbia College. Now, why is it called Columbia College? A question you must get often.
As I understand it, the college is founded around the time of the Columbia Exposition, which is is another one of those pieces of history that might lend us to kind of a question whether we should change the name. But at the same time as we're taking down the statue of Columbus or Christopher Columbus, and here we are on Columbus Day, in the state of Illinois, we no longer celebrate Columbus Day. It's Indigenous Peoples Day. But Columbus, the statue of Columbus, is also kind of in honor of the Columbian Exposition of the World Fair, which is in, I believe, 1892. So it's the 400th anniversary of the doctrine of discovery, Columbus arriving. The college is founded around that same time, initially as a school of locution, and it is primarily for women. It's founded by two women as a locution college, so public speaking, and it kind of evolves over time into an arts and media college over the course of the 20th century, and then around the 70s or 80s, they finally kind of get their act together, and it becomes accredited to administer BA degrees. So
this is a classic reform era moment of trying to get a unified English accent going amongst white people in the United States.
Perhaps, yes. I think that there was some sort of civic-minded, I don't know quite enough about the history, but there could also be something around suffragettes or speaking in public or something along these lines. I'm not exactly sure the origins, but there's long been a sort of social justice element to the school.
Saturday night here in Spain, the national football team was playing, and right afterwards, and it's on the national public broadcaster, albeit with commercials, and so everyone's watching. Right after that was this documentary that's now become world famous that discloses Cristobal Colon's DNA based on his remains, which are in the Dominican Republic, supposedly, and Sevilla, supposedly, which disclose, to the extent this is relevant, that he was not Italian, but was Spanish and probably Jewish. So the mythology is changing. And all of this was done, of course, in time for, or at the moment of last Friday, which here is their National Imperialism Day, to celebrate their wonderful gift of the Americas to the world.
Interesting. Well, so they're going in a little bit of a different direction then.
Just slightly. They're wanting to not only to celebrate him, but to reclaim him from those goddamn Italians and say he's one of us, goddammit.
Well, I think we can safely say they can have him.
Well, just 4 years before the foundation of Columbia College, a gigantic statue was erected in Barcelona, 1888. It's enormous, for another one of these big expositions of Cristobal Colon. And despite the fact that all over the world these things are being torn down by governments, by the popular classes, by resistance, it's so high up, this bloody thing. It's on a plinth up in the clouds that I think it would need a concerted governmental effort to remove it, probably involving the military. In any event, Prof, getting back to you, I wondered if you would share with us what's currently preoccupying, interesting, dynamizing, impeding you. What's happening for the Prof?
Well, a convergence of issues. A lot of my earlier work has been in kind of media studies and communication studies. And so sort of my current sort of thinking emerges from some of these movements that we're just sort of talking about, looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement and other movements for social justice that are largely, or at least the understanding is that they have been assisted and amplified and kind of pushed along by social media. But that sort of led me to thinking a lot more about not so much identity politics, but subjectivity as a sort of concept, and the way that subjectivity is related to another set of emergent kind of issues around trauma. Who gets to feel safe? That this is one of the sort of key ways to kind of think about these movements, is that it's really about who kind of gets to be safe. And this sort of has opened up all kinds of studies, and like trying to go back into all of the work that I missed when I was in graduate school. I didn't read nearly enough queer theory or definitely not any theory of sort of transgender politics. So those things are part of what's animating me, and then how that fits into the current political scene in the United States, which I think a few of your most recent interviews have kind of discussed, the kind of curious rise of especially anti-trans politics and how that's related to race and gender and these other kind of frameworks of subjectivity. So that's part of what I'm that's maybe a lot and maybe too much, and that's what's animating me right now.
Do you have a certain regret for what can be the tendency to center the media that can often occur when one discusses culture and politics? Did that, do you think, limit rather your purview?
Say more. When you say,
well, you're saying
limit.
that you did a lot of work in the area of media and communications, and now you regret what were the lines of interest that carried you in grad school. And
I think it wouldn't be so much about media as it would be almost like back to the sort of the two paradigms of cultural studies that maybe that Stuart Hall kind of lays out early on. The sort of structuralist versus the culturalist, and I think a lot of my earlier work was trying to sort of talk about structure, to talk about and in that framework, structuralism often defaulted to mean political economy, and so a lot of my earlier work is much more kind of in that vein, thinking about how does political economy work, trying to sort of square that circle to a certain extent, but in that process, I don't think I did enough kind of back reading back into some of these other disciplinary frameworks around critical race theory, feminist theory, queer theory, that would really kind of round out what often gets kind of discussed in terms of culturalism, or now the difference between political economy and identity politics, or something like that. So that would be my regret, is that mm-hmm. I didn't get enough of that earlier. I didn't focus enough of that earlier on.
Well, and some of those tendencies, not feminist theory certainly, took a lot of their form when you were already well into your studies.
True.
Which makes things a bit different. But in any event, so subjectivity, identity, and so on are things you're really thinking about a lot now. And if we go back to your earlier work, I suppose the stuff that was about squaring the circle, perhaps we could discuss that work, but maybe you want to rethink it, I don't know, in the light of these other influences, these latter-day influences. Because I suppose what you're perhaps known for, apart from your teaching and your administrative labor, which is enormous, is work on things like intellectual property and piracy. And these are things that conventionally fall within political economy, but have become enormously important questions for identity too, I would say.
Yeah. Well, and I think that one of the so one of the key concepts that I kind of use and that animates, especially the two monographs, so Hegemony, Mass Media and Cultural Studies, which is really that book was trying to especially square the circle between cultural studies frameworks and political economy and communication frameworks, and then the book after that was looking specifically at intellectual property rights. And in both of those works, I kind of really focus a lot on and talk a lot about the concept of primitive accumulation, and give that concept, I guess, bringing that concept into talking about how meaning gets made in the media, how the resources for making media or making meaning shift as culture becomes commodified, as the culture industry becomes sort of the dominant space of what Lawrence Levine calls the folklore of American society, right? This is of industrial society. So once you have the kind of mass media that is incorporating all of those meanings, then for a long time the technology makes it so that intellectual property rights aren't the way that gets kind of turned into something that people can't play with, right? It's the fact that you can't run a TV studio or a radio station yourself, right? Those meanings get distributed, they get owned by large corporate entities, especially in the U.S. context. This is mostly what I'm kind of looking at here.
Yes.
And so that is if we think about primitive accumulation in the kind of Marxist tradition, this is when you can no longer basically sustain yourself, right? When you can't necessarily create and distribute culture in the same way that these large corporate entities can. This is a form of kind of primitive accumulation. And so I sort of use this framework to think about how that then shifts as the technology becomes more open. And so I think that there's a direct kind of linkage to what I'm thinking about now, which is, in both of those works, I'm really kind of leading up to the internet as a space, at least ostensibly, of a more democratic or demotic, anyway, scene of cultural production and consumption, where people can, everyday people are more able to both create and distribute culture at, roughly at the same level, to use kind of media ecology terminology as I do in the first book, with the same bias, which is the kind of Harold Innis idea, and temperature, which is the kind of McLuhan. It has the same fidelity, it has the same kind of ability to kind of travel as something that a legacy media corporation can produce, and that's maybe the shift. And with that shift in the earlier text, I'm talking about how this undermines some of that primitive accumulation, and that intellectual property rights are a means of kind of bringing that to heel, trying to bring that back to heel.
And is there necessarily a conflict between focusing on political economy and focusing on issues to do with gender and sexuality and trans/queer questions? I don't see that there is necessarily any. Really.
I don't think there is. I think that it just wasn't in the frame of political economy at the time. In fact, the most recent edition of the Transgender Studies Quarterly is about kind of Marxism and kind of transgender theory. And so this is definitely, there's definitely quite a lot of work that has been done in the last 10 or 15 years. But for a long time, there's been this tension with those frameworks. And so I think that was something that kind of was a lacuna for me. And so, and then we also have the emergence of social reproduction theory in a new vein, which is made kind of feminist theory, informed by a much more robust understanding of how capitalism reproduces itself.
People are always looking for a magical agent of history, and they're forever getting disappointed.
Yeah. Well, and this is something that it's not just an academic problem. Right?
Yeah. Well said, sir.
Yeah.
So I imagine people are interested in your take on artificial intelligence at the moment, given that there is immense anxiety in education about artificial intelligence writing essays. There is immense anxiety in science about papers being produced by it. And scholarly publishers can't wait to sell everything to artificial intelligence hegemons. In fact, they've done it already without asking authors.
Is it is it Sage who I just read something about which is the major public not publishers but portals.
Well, Springer is the biggest
Springer,
scholarly publisher in terms of revenue, I think. And then it would be Taylor and Francis, and Sage is a minor player because it doesn't really do science and medicine and engineering, which is where the big money is in play.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank. I read a few weeks ago that they had opened it up to, they basically sold the database to one of these artificial intelligence servers. I'm very I'm a little bit hesitant, and I realize there are all sorts of issues that this is bringing up, especially the kinds of things that you're talking about in the classroom, students using it to help kind of write essays, which is something that I've already experienced, and we've had to kind of deal with writing different kinds of assignments, so that isn't quite as easy for a student to do. But I also, my partner does a lot of work kind of training some AI for her job, and these instruments are actually pretty stupid. until you figure out the kind of prompt that is going to get you the kind of output that you want. And it is a very, very intricate dance that you're doing with this device, with this robot, to get it to spit something out that you feel like is of the right quality. And then after that, you have a lot more kind of human labor involved in refining that. So I think I think all of the anxieties that you hear, whether it's in the film industry, whether it's in academia, whether it's in the music industry, these are long-standing kinds of concerns. Back to like machine breaking and things like this, right? Automation of any kind has the potential, and in many cases, the goal of the capitalists who are in charge of it, or who are kind of taking that as the sort of the savior. Their goal is to get rid of labor. That's obviously what they're after. But I always have a lot more faith that their ambitions are not going to be realized in quite the same way as they imagined, and not just because people are demonstrating, or the port workers are going on strike. Those are the things that will definitely help to kind of ensure some sort of contractual protection. But I also think that at the moment, I'm recalling about, and I'm sure you'll recall, about 10 years ago, we had the MOOC, which was supposed to also replace all of us, right? You're going to be these massively online open courses that were going to replace all of us. And I was also a little skeptical that was going to happen. And I don't think many of the people who we're talking to now won't even know what that thing was.
50 years ago, literally very close to 50 years ago, people I knew studying computer science told me that nothing that I was interested in mattered, and that artificial intelligence was about to take over the entirety of life. And anybody who's knowledgeable about the history of communications technologies will see that the dystopic and utopic antinomies that are presented to us with reference to artificial intelligence repeat what's been around since the beginning of the juncture of selling cheaply produced fiction to young children at railway terminals.
Sure.
In the 19th century. And this is not to say nothing on the earth is new, but it's to say in support of what you indicate, namely, yes, this is an attempt to decimate the importance of labor, needs to be addressed seriously. But the monumental claims made are only matched by the monumental claims made over and over and over again by things that then fail to produce what they allegedly produced.
Yeah.
Or produce something that gets resumed to a very recognizable pattern of oligarchic and oligopolistic conduct. But in terms of teaching, give me some clues, Prof, because when I was last teaching in the US a couple of years ago at a big, private, wealthy institution for the ruling class, the students spent all lecture time on their telephones. If they were boys, they were following sports betting. If they were girls, they were following influencers on makeup and fashion. I know this because I would walk around and see what they were looking at, and they didn't hide. I tried to refine my pedagogy to focus on their issues, specifically the young women's, because there were very few young men. So I would talk about the political economy and the culture influencing. They still didn't listen. And because they were highly schooled from elite private secondary institutions, they did brilliantly in the class. They didn't need to listen.
Sure.
They just needed to work out my prejudices, satisfy them. So enough of my incredibly exciting life. Tell us how you're dealing with these technologies in the classroom. You've already mentioned having to deal with some artificial intelligence issues. which I've not yet encountered in person.
Well, I mean, I think I'm still at a loss for the only way that I've kind of discovered that's going to keep students from just sitting there on their computers, because this is a problem that I still encounter. Students sort of sitting there on the phone or on the laptop, which is somewhat difficult because I usually distribute most of the course materials on digitally, and then there's a kind of a learning management system that they are supposed to access digitally. So there's a legitimate reason for them to have a device in front of them, right? There's plausible deniability as to what they're getting on about, even if I am not walking around. And so, I mean, one of the first things that I also, from a political economy standpoint, is to highlight to them the amount of money that they're spending every hour that they're sitting in that seat. And just to kind of say, if you went to a yoga class or you went to a sort of some sort of session, and you paid your $20, you wouldn't sit there with your phone on the whole time. You would try to participate, and this is several orders of magnitude more that you're paying to sit in this chair for this 3-hour session, and so maybe let's try to engage. But that only helps so much. So I think it's much more about active learning, making sure that they're engaged in conversations, making sure that they're talking to one another, have them in small group conversations, and then if nothing else, then during that period they are engaged and listening and talking. And those are the kinds of things that in the classroom it's important to do. For things like papers, essays, I think most of like what I do there is to make sure that they one of the components of the assignment, and this is something I've done kind of all the time, which is to have them speak about their own experience, and have them incorporate the theories and the readings that we're doing in relation to what's going on in their lives. And not only does that make it a little more enticing to write and maybe kind of lower the barrier. I'm teaching students that are much more diverse in terms of especially their class origin, if not kind of racial and ethnic origin. Students who are, I mean, I think right now Colombia's almost more than half first generation, definitely more than half students of color, and I think we're close to 40% LGBTQ identifying, which is a different, that's another index of the student body that we're working with.
Yes.
But having them speak about their own life, their own background, and then also have them present that usually I have them present in a digital forum where they are then presenting to their fellow students, which on the one hand maybe makes it slightly more formal, but also less, because it's kind of like a conversation. So those are the kinds of things that we do to kind of make sure that they're, I guess, not. So in other words, to make it less attractive to use those tools, but also, I also frequently employ having them do research on Wikipedia and to talk about how Wikipedia works, which then kind of introduces that space that they're probably going to go to anyway, and that makes it less likely that will be the only thing they rely on.
And Prof, this leads me into worrying a bit, because one can sound so critical of young people in these conversations, and that's never a good thing. But into one of your other projects, a notable edited collection, Cultural Studies in the Classroom and Beyond. To what extent is cultural studies informing and being informed by your classroom? And what about beyond the campus, beyond the cloisters?
Well, on the campus that I work on at Columbia, I think that in many cases our students were well ahead of the curve in terms of introducing, for lack of a better term, the sort of woke elements of culture,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it was students who led the college to have policies around pronouns. Declaring your pronouns, having your pronouns, placed in your biography or in your signature. Having a space in the classroom at some point to sort of talk about that. And that's just one kind of index. But I think certainly there was a very vocal and passionate group of students who were already heavily engaged in talking about issues around race, issues around gender, in ways that maybe even professors in cultural studies, although we talk about it in theory, the sort of much more kind of maybe even activist oriented practices of how you engage in a classroom discussion, I think those were not formalized in any way. It kind of depended on what the professor kind of felt, and as you know, even the most liberal American university has plenty of faculty members who are not necessarily ready to engage with these ideas. And so I think that in many ways that it's the students who kind of help to push that conversation, and for me, it also helped to kind of push what I thought needed to be discussed. So in the book that I'm working on right now, I kind of talk about I had a brief fellowship in the early 2010s when I was away from the classroom for a couple of years. 2013, came back into the classroom, ready to do a kind of discussion around the concept of cultural appropriation, which is something that is just one of the many concepts around semiotics, around kind of cultural theory that I was discussing. And all of my students, or at least a very vocal and passionate group of them, were very well aware of this concept. They were kind of steeped in it as what it meant, what the politics of it were, and were very, very clear on what is right and what is wrong, right? In ways that I probably wouldn't have been as drawn as stark a line. But I think that's another kind of example. I think that many of the students kind of then pushed me to go, well, we need to actually move like 3 or 4 steps ahead of this. We need to be thinking in, where does this come from? What are the nuances here? How is this related to concepts around race, concepts around gender, nationality? And so I think that kind of pushes you to kind of up the ante for what students are ready to talk about in your class.
Prof, it sounds as though you're torn between seeing students as the vanguard and seeing them as completely disengaged.
Well, I think that depends on the day. But no, I think, I think one of the things, those are, I don't think those are actually entirely mutually exclusive. I think that much of the time when students are disengaged, it's because they're bored. And they feel like they've already heard some of this discussion.
They're bored with what I have to say, Prof.
Well, maybe not exactly, maybe not exactly, but I think that in some cases they've been having these conversations to some extent. They've heard critiques of representation on BuzzFeed for their entire life, right? They've been reading, they've been watching TikToks or seeing it on Instagram, or there's places where this kind of critique is kind of part of the daily discussion, right? And so if I think that it's easy for them to tune out and be like, oh well, I already know what that is. I don't need to kind of really engage on this level because I'm familiar with it. I've already kind of fixed my understanding of what I believe about it, and I can, like one that you said, that as long as they know what your biases are or what your what would you, I forget the word that you use, but
I may have said prejudices.
prejudices, yeah. What what your partialities are,
Yeah.
and that they can feed those back to you if they're absorbing just enough to be able to then parrot that back. So I think that it is really kind of trying to see, well, what's gonna be the next level that we have to go to. What do we need to kind of actually bring that conversation
beautifully put.
yeah, and that's often what I find.
We're getting a little bit of reverberation in the sound,
yeah.
which could be to do with having volume up. It could be proximity to the microphone or other electronic devices. It's not all the time, but it's there.
I had a fan on down here. I don't know if that's maybe
who
that was
knows?
it.
Maybe that was what Jimi Hendrix was doing to stay cool on stage, or Pete Townsend. So, moving on to another big topic that you've addressed that obviously relates in part to your interests in intellectual property, and that's cultural studies and the law. You produced a book about that. What's the deal there, Prof?
Well, I think that this is that collection. There's a lot, a wide variety of objects that folks are looking at, but also sort of, I guess there's a kind of overriding question about what to do, how to affect social change, right? How to affect cultural change, and the ways that the and how that kind of how the law sits in that framework. And I think that there's sort of a couple of essays that are looking, for instance, at, well, we can kind of watch how cultural movements, so say the gay rights movement, I should say not the gay rights movement in toto, but a certain very empowered element of the gay rights movement moved to use the same kinds of techniques that the NAACP did to get a Supreme Court case that would help legalize gay marriage, right? That this sort of pattern where you go, the aim is not necessarily to have a legislative route and to go through the legislatures and to create this sort of groundswell of kind of democratic support for a notion. Instead, to kind of move and to get it made into a Supreme Court precedent that then forces the hand of legislatures and around the country. And so there's a couple of articles kind of looking at this is a question. Is this the mechanism that we should kind of think about for social change? Because it does create social change. It does create a way of enshrining gay marriage as a right for everyone. But it in much the same way as sort of the integration movement had a Supreme Court precedent, and then there was a cultural backlash, right? So what are the other tools that we have to create kind of cultural and social change? And what I think that one of the we had a collection that was in cultural studies. Jafar Ksikas, my colleague at Columbia College, and I had a collection in the Journal of Cultural Studies, or had a special issue. When we moved that to when we had that published with Routledge, it was sort of right around 2014, 2015, when Black Lives Matter had really become a cultural force in the United States, especially after the August 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, the murder of Mike Brown there, and this was I guess this was a moment when within a certain element of the left there was still apprehension, right? And I think there's you can still find it in the American left quite a bit. Is this movement around race? Is this movement for racial justice the right vector to be organizing around? And as opposed to a kind of some sort of class-based organizing or something more in the vein of political economy. And I think that and this kind of relates to that question about the role of the law, because the movement was really about how the law functions, how these institutions of the law function, and it became a kind of cultural force to try to reform that. And there was quite a bit of consternation, and I know our argument again was that these are not mutually exclusive, and that especially if you look at what was going on in Ferguson at the time, when you have the city government was basically funded in large part by the tickets and the fines and the fees that were imposed on especially the African American community in Ferguson. They were using that racial divide to fund the city. So anyway, maybe that's a longer answer.
No, great. And you mentioned the NAACP. For listeners not familiar with that, perhaps outside the US, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that historically was founded by and run for and by African Americans, and has tended to focus on African American issues. And it's one of those things that might have a different title if it were created today, but has been utterly crucial in the development of human rights as a discourse and as a material reality in the United States. And of course, not only in the United States, because the example of African Americans struggling for human rights has been inspirational in many, many other parts of the world. So that's interesting. What happens when you're involved in a research project or an editing one, and something happens in the outside world that really alters what you're on about, which is what happened with Black Lives Matter in that book, by the sound of it?
Yeah, it isn't something. So I guess you can go one of two ways, right? You could just write the book you were going to write, which is, I guess, in a perfect, I guess in a very disciplined writing style, that's kind of what you would do. You would just sort of say, well, this is this project that I have, and I'm going to complete this project, and then I will move on and I'll write something else about this other kind of intersecting or related matter. This is an issue that kind of happened for me as I was completing the revisions on the second monograph on intellectual property rights, which I was completing the revisions on this, or I was writing the revision of this manuscript after Charlottesville, Virginia, which for the global listeners in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the summer of 2017, there was a group of folks who are petitioning to take down one of these statues. Most of these statues put up around the time that the NAACP was becoming a profoundly important force in American politics in the early part of the 20th century. This is a time when all of a sudden these courthouses around the country start putting up these monuments to Confederate generals, none of whom, few of whom had any living descendants and had little reason to be celebrated. And yet there's a kind of move to put these statues in the town square in front of the courthouses as a sort of monument to white supremacy in cities around the country. And of course, there is a political economy element to this, which is that these statues are mostly made possible by a new fabrication technique that makes it so that you don't have this massive, I'm sure whatever the statue in Barcelona is, it's solid. It's a solid piece of metal. And most of the statues that we're talking about here, they've kind of figured out a way to fabricate them so that they're just kind of hollow and much cheaper and easier to move and easier to transport. And so it becomes something you can just kind of buy through a catalog and have installed in your town square. So the threshold for what it takes to get one of these statues put into your town square is lowered, and so that it kind of facilitates the white supremacy to kind of enter the courthouse grounds. And so this happens all around the country in the early 20th century. And with this sort of racial reckoning in the United States, starting with Black Lives Matter in 2013, and really kind of throughout the middle of the 2010s, we have movements to remove these statues from town squares.
Yes.
And one of these statues was in the city of Charlottesville, Virginia, and the city council had passed an ordinance that they wanted to have this statue removed, and the kind of newly ensconced, right-wing movements, mostly through the internet, right? There's a really great recent book by the Vice reporter Elle Reeve, who did the interview with some of these protesters. It's called Black Pill, and she kind of gives some of the backstory on the internet movements that kind of fueled this. But they decide to sort of stage a rally here. Many of these groups coming out of very kind of admittedly white supremacist, racist, neo-Nazi backgrounds to sort of stage a rally here. If you'll probably remember them carrying tiki torches and kind of walking through the town square. And on the second day of those protests, one of the kind of right-wing activists drove his car into a group of protesters and killed one of them, a woman named Heather Hare, and he was part of one of these really extreme neo-Nazi groups, and so this happened as I was revising my book, and I couldn't kind of square not having that be at least part of the context for what I was trying to talk about. And because I had kind of said this is something that's going on right now around intellectual property rights, around the culture of property. How does this event and this kind of emergent set of cultural forces relate to the thing I'm writing here? And I couldn't kind of not have something to say about it. So the first chapter of that book, and really I tried to bring it to the conclusion, is to kind of talk about how this neoliberal cultural property that I talk about throughout the book is related to these what would seem to be movements that are in some ways against capitalism as it's been kind of formed in neoliberalism, right? So you have Donald Trump in 2016 coming out against NAFTA and saying that one of the first things he's going to do when he becomes president is to kind of get rid of NAFTA. There's a real idea that he was also appealing to people who had been hurt by offshoring, by plant closures and automation and things like this. And so that is a very that sort of messed with some of my earlier understanding of what was going on with the neoliberal cultural property. And so I needed to kind of refine it, and ended up using, talking about the way that these are related to what Nancy Fraser calls the triple movements, for extending, if there was a double movement that created the New Deal, then the triple movements were movements for equality, racial equality, gender equality, equality around indigenous rights and gender and sexuality. So progressive neoliberalism.
Prof, two more questions for you, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
And once I've posed those questions and you've answered them, I want to give you the opportunity, as we conclude matters, to add anything you wish. And that might be entirely new material, or it could be traversing terrain we've already covered. Yeah? Sound okay?
Sounds fine.
So first question is about the fact that you've spent 2 years as the president of the Cultural Studies Association. And prior to that, you were vice president, and you've been very intimately involved in its workings for some time. What's it like being so clearly at the center of an attempt to provide an institutional home for people, especially when, unlike most academic associations in the US and elsewhere, this doesn't fit neatly onto a thing called the Department of?
Mm-hmm. It's a great group of people to be involved with. And I would say that for the entire time that I've been working with the CSA, I was treasurer for 5 years before that. So really, like, the last few months, as I've kind of stepped away from being president, it's been a very strange experience to not be involved in one way or another in the day-to-day operations. But I think that there's a vitality and an energy to the work that people bring to that space, as you know, as a former president, and I think it one of the issues that the only issue that I think we run up against is kind of what you're talking about in terms of the institutional support. As institutional support has become less available, especially for graduate students, it does become more difficult for people to travel, people to show up. And I think this is kind of more of a symptom of the larger U.S. academic landscape. Just that we're in a phase of austerity in many ways, and it has made it difficult because if you don't have a lot of institutional support, you end up going to the disciplinary conference first. That's the one you have to end up going to. And so the interdisciplinary, maybe the one that has a lot more energy and camaraderie, enthusiasm, but maybe isn't one that your department sees as central to the field. Then it's harder to make the case for that being a travel request. So that's led to, and I think you've been part of that organization as we had to transition during the pandemic. We had several years where we were completely virtual, and then we kind of took that virtual model and turned it into a hybrid model that worked really well. It's one I think that people who have come to those hybrid conferences have said that it works better than many of the much more slickly polished versions that have really expensive platforms. But I think they're at a turning point, and I think the next conference they're going to try to do all in person because it has made it difficult to create the in-person community post-COVID. And post-COVID, not, on a number of levels. Some people are still very anxious about traveling, about being in person for kind of immunocompromised health reasons. And then there's also just less money. I think that the plan is to be in Southern California for the next conference, and there's quite a lot of cultural studies interest in California. So I'm hoping that gives them a critical mass for folks to be mostly in person.
And my last question prior to throwing things open to you, Sean, Prof. A, is to inquire about what you're currently working on.
So kind of related to all the things that we've discussed, I guess the easiest or the most succinct way of saying what I'm working on is that I've been developing a set of kind of theoretical paradigms or concepts that would help to kind of explain some of what is going on. And maybe mostly for myself, but also, hopefully to others as well, with the movements for what is being called about like movements for social justice. But what it kind of has ended up becoming for me is really a discussion about how subjectivity works and how interpolation works, and revising some of those concepts from Althusser that inform some of my earlier work, but I think are a little aren't up to the task of describing the way that especially the hierarchy of race, gender, sexuality kind of actually operates. And I would also say doesn't do enough justice to the way that repression and trauma operate in those apparatuses for the vast majority of people, right? So to sort of take this concept of interpolation, which is central to Althusser's vision of how we're kind of interpolated into our subjectivity, right? We in some ways we freely choose it, but it's because there's all sorts of mechanisms that make that the most comfortable place to be sitting, right? And there's a lot of discussion in political theory. So a recent book by a scholar named James Martell, this concept of misinterpolation, which he looks at a variety of, his interest is primarily in reading like the works of Fanon, reading Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and his question is, well, so there's a line in Althusser that says 9 times out of 10, when someone is kind of called into place by their interpolation, it's the right person. And so he says, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be called into place, but then you show up, someone else shows up, right? And so, and his argument is that there is a kind of a person who, or a kind of person who is meant to be called into place. And then one way of understanding what Frantz Fanon is talking about in especially like Black Skin, White Masks, or Ralph Ellison in The Invisible Man, is that this is, or Toussaint Louverture in the Haitian Revolution, showing up. I think that's maybe one of the best examples, and saying, yes, we are, all people are created equal, all men are created equal, and so therefore, yes, I am created equally, even though I'm a slave. And so this, answering the call that is not intended for you. So this is an interesting kind of play on what Althusser is saying. But then my question then is, well, if that person was not called, that's not entirely accurate, because they were called. They just were called to be a different person, right? They weren't. They were misinterpolated by answering a call that wasn't intended for them. But really, what that implies is that there is also something that I'm calling a disinterpolation, which is that you were you were you were supposed to be in that kind of abject position. That's the place that you were supposed to be. Um, and that abject position is one that is much more saturated with the inflicting trauma as a means to keep you in that disinterpolated place. Um, and so this is kind of when I say that I'm interested in who gets to be safe, who gets to be able to traverse the city street, uh, you know, to be called by the police and to turn around and not feel quite the same threat. That there is a hierarchy that Althusser and that a lot of kind of political theory around subjectivity uh, isn't talking about so much. So that's a a very brief understanding of what a brief overview of what I'm working on.
Sure. And again, for some listeners who may not have read Althusser, this is interpolation, not
Yes.
interpolation, but interpellation. And interpolation here refers to the parliamentary norms established after the French Revolution, when you were interpellated, meaning you were given the call, you were to speak. So like the speaker in the House of Representatives in the United States, or the speaker in, most spectacularly, the House of Commons in Britain. Now, Prof, as I said, I wanted to conclude things by handing matters over to you, lest there be things you might wish to add to our discussion to this point.
Well, I think that what I would add, and maybe kind of like to kind of tie it back to some of the earlier interviews I've been hearing, is that to go back to the question of cultural studies and the law, to talk about what it is that we're kind of, that we could say is the vision for the future, because I think there are a lot of tensions running through, especially if, one of the tensions I've been looking at is the tension between, within what in the United States is now a sort of like shorthand for the Me Too movement, which is basically movements around protecting women, or people who identify as women, but there's a sort of a very specific way that woman is meant here in the United States, and that there's one of the main answers there is a sort of carceral response, right? That there needs to be a way that the state is protecting, is punishing, and that this in many ways runs, right against the movements for abolition that might be more central to the movement for Black Lives, and really for many other feminist and queer movements, right? And so I think that there's a real, I have a real interest in rethinking the role of the state here, the role of the state, and how we kind of conceive of care going forward, and how do we kind of structure and institutionalize in one way or another a more equitable system of care that doesn't necessarily rely on the state, but that will need, by one way or another, to have that kind of resource, right? The resources and the reach of something like the state. So that's, I think, one of the concerns that I have right now is just that squaring that circle, because there's every reason to be suspicious of those, of any institutionalization, especially through the state. But on the other hand, I'm very happy to live in a state, state of Illinois, where trans people can get gender affirming care, and that's part of the state mandate, where women can have reproductive freedom. And so, yeah. So I think I don't know if I'm not sure if that's a new thing to talk about, or just maybe a part of the final word.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking to you, Sean. Prof, you are always wonderfully teacherly in the best sense of the term, and I deeply appreciate the time you've spent with us.
Well, thank you. Always good to talk to you too, Toby.